You know the feeling. You're cruising through a logical reasoning section, you hit a main point question, you read the stimulus, you nod along, you think, okay, I've got this. Then you pick your answer, confidently, proudly, maybe even a little cocky. And then you check the answer key. Wrong. Not just wrong, but cleanly, absolutely, unquestionably wrong. Like the test wasn't just grading you, it was mocking you. It's not even the fact that you missed it. It's that it didn't feel like you were going to miss it. That answer felt good. It felt strong. It sounded like the main idea. It even had the same words as the stimulus. And yet, somehow, it wasn't the main point. So you start asking yourself, wait, what exactly is a main point? Was I supposed to be reading that differently? Do I even understand how arguments work? And the spiral begins. The irony is that most students actually do understand the passage. They're reading it carefully. They're tracking the content. They're not missing words or zoning out, but they're still getting the question wrong. Why? Because the LSAT is not a reading test, it's a logic test. It doesn't care how clearly you understood the topic. It cares whether you understood the structure, who's supporting what, and why. This is why so many students get stuck here, even at higher score levels. I've worked with students scoring 165 and above who still mess up main point questions regularly. Not because they don't get it, but because they're looking for the wrong thing. They're searching for the most important sounding sentence, the loudest sentence, the one that feels like a thesis. But the LSAT doesn't reward your feelings. It rewards your ability to follow the direction of support. And that's exactly why, when we work with students one-on-one, we don't just drill practice problems, we break down argument structure until it becomes second nature. Because once you learn how to read for logic instead of content, main point questions become way easier, even the hardest ones. So here's the good news. If this kind of question has ever made you feel dumb, you're not alone. This is one of the most common traps on the LSAT. But it's also one of the most fixable. You don't need to try harder. You don't need to slow down to a crawl. You just need a better lens for what the test is actually asking. And once you've got that, the path forward is surprisingly simple. Most students miss main point questions because they're using the wrong mental model. Here's the typical process. You read the passage. You highlight what feels big. You ask yourself, what's the big picture here? What sounds like a thesis statement? And which sentence has the fanciest vocabulary? And this is a totally understandable approach. After all, that's how you were trained to read all throughout school. In high school English, you got points for spotting the themes, the tone, and the main ideas. You were rewarded for interpretations that sounded good. But the LSAT doesn't care. The LSAT doesn't want your interpretation. It wants your analysis. And that's a huge difference. Because on the LSAT, the main idea isn't the sentence that sounds deep. It's the one that's proven by the rest of the passage. And that's the trap. The test writers know what you're looking for, so they bait you. They write a sentence that feels central with a big claim, bold words, and it's emotionally satisfying. It's the verbal equivalent of fireworks. And then they quietly support a totally different, less flashy sentence, the real conclusion, with everything else in the stimulus. It's like a magician doing sleight of hand. While you're staring at the shiny thing, they're moving the real answer into position somewhere else. So if you've ever picked a sentence that sounded important but got the question wrong, you weren't crazy, you just got fooled by design. Here's what you need to know. The right answer is not the most important sentence. It's the one that everything else in the argument is trying to prove. That's the key. And that's why this isn't about reading harder. It's about reading smarter. It's about knowing what the LSAT is actually testing and adjusting your lens accordingly. When we work with students on this, we train them to stop asking what's the main idea, and instead we ask which sentence is supported by the others. And that one shift unlocks everything. You go from guessing based on tone to knowing based on structure. And it's not always obvious right away. But once you start reading arguments like little machines, each sentence giving or receiving support, it becomes a lot easier to spot what the LSAT wants you to pick. And just like that, A question type that used to feel random starts to feel automatic. Now, let me guess. After you get a main point question wrong, you don't shrug and say, I had no idea what was going on. No, what you actually say is, that just seemed like the main thing. Or, I thought that's what the author was trying to say overall. Or, my personal favorite, it felt right. Let's pause on that one. It felt right. Look, I get it, we're human. We make choices based on feelings all the time. But the LSAT doesn't care about your feelings. It's not testing your ability to vibe with the passage. It's testing your ability to analyze structure. So if your reasoning boils down to, this sentence feels main, you're already halfway into the trap. Let me show you what to do instead. Instead of asking, which seems central, ask, what is the best supported claim in this passage? That is your new North Star. You're not a poet. You're not a book critic. You're not trying to find the most elegant line. You are a logic detective. Your job is to track where the support is going, because that tells you where the conclusion is. And that one change, replacing what feels important with what's being supported, is like switching from a fuzzy camera to HD. You start noticing things you didn't even realize were there. And this isn't just theory. When we coach students through this shift, we see the light bulb go on every single time. It's like they suddenly realize the LSAT isn't random. It's just built on rules they hadn't been taught before. So the next time you're tempted to pick the sentence that feels like the point, stop. Zoom out, follow the structure, and ask yourself, what's getting all the backup here? That's your main point. Now, let's break this down like we're in 5th grade. And no shame, the LSAT wants to make smart people feel confused. So we go back to the basics. You're reading an LSAT argument. It's not just a bunch of sentences tossed in a blender. It's structured on purpose. And 99% of the time, the structure looks like this. Some sentences are providing support, aka the premises or the evidence. And one sentence is receiving that support, aka the conclusion, the main point. If you can figure out which sentence is being held up by the others, you found the main point. Think of it like a courtroom scene. The witnesses are giving testimony, and those are your premises. The verdict is the claim they're trying to prove, and that's your main point. The verdict doesn't stand on its own. It needs those witnesses. It relies on them. Without their support, the whole thing falls apart. So, when you're reading a stimulus and trying to figure out what matters most, here's your job. Ask, which sentence is being backed up by the others? That's it. That's your main point. And that's the claim that everything else exists to support. Let me make this even clearer. You are not looking for the boldest claim, the longest sentence, the one that matches the question stem's wording, or the sentence you personally agree with. None of that matters. You are looking for the sentence that requires the others in order to make sense. Sometimes it's flashy, sometimes it's boring, and sometimes it's sitting quietly in the middle of the paragraph like it doesn't want attention. Doesn't matter. If it's being supported, it's your main point. When we work with students on this, we treat every stimulus like a little puzzle. Not what sounds good, but what's the logic doing here? And once students start thinking like that, they don't just get main point questions right, they start seeing structure everywhere. That's how you train yourself to stop reading like a student and start reading like a lawyer. It's a skill, and it's 100% learnable. Now here's a simple test you can use on every single main point question. I call it the direction of support test. And yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. You figure out where the support is going, and that tells you which sentence is the conclusion. Here's how to use it. Step 1, pick a sentence in the stimulus that might be the conclusion. Step 2, ask yourself, is this sentence being supported by the others? Or is this sentence supporting something else? That's it. If it's receiving support, ding, 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 you found your main point. If it's giving support, it's a premise. Keep looking. Let's make this physical. Actually, raise your finger when you do this. Point up or point down and say, is the support going toward this sentence, or is it coming from this sentence? You might feel ridiculous the first time you do it, but trust me, it works. You'll start noticing patterns you never saw before. You'll stop falling for the feels central trap. you'll be actively testing ideas, not passively hoping for a match. Think of it like a seesaw. On one side, you have your premises. On the other, you have your conclusion. Only one side is being lifted up by the other. And that lifted side, that's your main point. I know it sounds almost too simple, but I've seen this one trick, this direction of support lens, take students from missing half their main point questions to getting nearly all of them right. It turns guessing into deduction. And when we work with students one-on-one, this is one of the first habits we drill, because once you can trace support like this, you stop reading in circles. You read with purpose, and that changes everything. So let's walk through an example, and don't worry, we're going to keep it spoiler-free and zoom in on the structure, not the content. Here's how the stimulus starts. Inspiring perpetual curiosity is necessary to being an intriguing person. Sounds deep, right? Like something you'd read in a philosophy blog or see on a TED Talk slide. A lot of students stop right here and go, ah yes, that's the main point, case closed. But not so fast. Let's keep going. One way to inspire that curiosity is to challenge your worldview. And then, this method works because it creates tension that drives exploration. Now pause. If we were using our old, what sounds important mindset, we'd be stuck on that first sentence. But you've got a new lens now. Let's apply the direction of support test. Look at that last sentence. Quote, this method works because it creates tension. That is a premise, a reason to believe the second sentence. So that third sentence is supporting the second one. Now look at the second sentence. One way to inspire that curiosity is to challenge your worldview. What's going on here? This is the only sentence that is being supported by another, but not supporting anything else. That is your main point. The first sentence is context. It sets up the conversation like the opening act. But the second sentence, that is the headliner. That is the claim the argument is trying to get you to believe. That is what everything else is working to justify. So if you were reading for what sounds central, you might have picked the first sentence and walked right into the trap. But if you're reading for structure, it becomes obvious. The conclusion is the one getting all the help. And when we walk students through examples like this during our coaching sessions, we don't even look at the choices at first. We just dissect the stimulus. We ID the claim, that's getting the backup. Then, and only then, do we look at the answers and match it. And this changes the game completely, because now you're not guessing, you're verifying. And on a test where precision matters, that's everything. Now here is another example. First sentence of the stimulus, quote, many different hormones can independently raise blood glucose levels. Strong opening. Sounds like a science textbook, right? Factual, authoritative, sounds important. And that's where a lot of people stop thinking. They go, well, that's a big claim. It's got numbers. Hormones, glucose, feels headline-worthy, probably the main point. But the stimulus isn't over. Next sentence, quote, this is likely due to the brain's reliance on a steady supply of glucose, which it cannot store. Now, let's slow down and run the direction of support test. What's happening here? That first sentence, the one about hormones, is a setup, a given. The author is stating it as an established fact. Then they immediately follow it with why that fact is true. This is likely due to. That is a supporting phrase. It's giving a reason. And reasons don't float on their own. They are holding something up. So, what's being held up? The idea that the brain's need for glucose explains why hormones behave this way. And that second sentence, the one about the brain, isn't just another random fact. It's the claim being supported. It's the interpretation the author is trying to prove. So, counterintuitive as it may feel, the boring-sounding scientific explanation is actually the main point. And the flashy, stat-heavy opener is just background. And this is classic LSAT trickery. The test knows that big, bold facts grab your attention, so it front-loads them. Then it quietly slips in the real conclusion halfway through, wrapped in unassuming language like due to or because. And this is why students get tripped up. They're not wrong for thinking the first sentence sounds important. It does. But the test isn't asking, what's the most important fact? It's asking, What is the author trying to convince you of? And the answer is, the brain's glucose needs explain the hormone behavior. That's the idea being lifted up. That's your main point. And when we train students to spot this, we actually make them ignore the flashier sentences first, just to prove the point. Because once you train your brain to look for support relationships instead of content weight, you stop falling for the bait. And you start seeing the structure behind every stimulus, no matter how boring or sciencey it looks on the surface. Now, I know what you might be thinking right now. You're thinking, okay, Steve, this all makes sense when the argument's tidy, but what about when everything sounds important? What about those passages where there's no obvious conclusion and the whole stimulus just feels like a string of facts? And you're not wrong. Sometimes the LSAT plays dirty. Sometimes it doesn't hand you a nice, clean conclusion. Instead, it hands you a bunch of ideas, all written in the same tone. No flashy language, no therefore, no clear pivot into conclusion territory. And that's when most students go back to their old habits, skimming for key phrases, grabbing the biggest idea, and picking whatever feels the most main, and the cycle repeats. So what do you do when the argument feels flat? This is where the direction of support test becomes a superpower. Here are 3 quick questions you can use to break down even the murkiest stimulus. First, which sentence depends on the others to make sense? If one idea only makes sense because the others are true, that's your conclusion. Second, which sentence is being explained, not explaining? Explanations are premises. The thing being explained, that's the conclusion. And third, if I deleted one sentence, which would cause the rest to fall apart? That is your structural keystone, the sentence being held up by everything else. This approach works even when the LSAT is trying to keep things vague. When we work with students, we train this like a muscle, not just on main point questions, but on flaw, strengthen, necessary assumption, and even in reading comp. Because once you learn to trace support, you start to notice something strange. Most LSAT arguments only exist to make one sentence feel inevitable. The rest is just scaffolding. Once you find that sentence, the one everything else is working to justify, you've cracked the code. It won't always feel obvious, and that's okay. You're not trying to become perfect at it. You're just trying to get better at seeing how ideas connect. And the best part is, the more you practice this, the faster it becomes. You'll go from squinting at each individual sentence to seeing the structure at a glance. Now, let's take a step back for a second. You might be wondering, okay, I get the idea, but why does this strategy work so consistently? Here's why. Because the LSAT is built on logic, and logic has rules. When an author makes an argument, they're not just tossing out statements and hoping one of them sticks. They are building towards something one piece at a time. And your job on main point questions is to figure out what the final product is. Imagine you're building IKEA furniture. The conclusion is the finished bookshelf. The premises are all the wooden planks, random metal rods, and all those little hex screws that roll under your couch and disappear forever. If you try to put the top shelf on first, everything collapses. But if you follow the instructions, what piece supports what, you end up with something sturdy, something that holds weight. And that's exactly what this supported claim strategy gives you, a manual for following LSAT arguments. Instead of asking which sentence looks good, you're asking which one is being held up by the rest. It's practical, repeatable, and testable. You're not relying on intuition. You're not falling back on, well, this sentence sounded the most convincing. You're looking for evidence of support. And that's why this strategy doesn't just help you on main point questions. It rewires how you approach arguments entirely. When we teach this to students, they start noticing something wild. The same skill that helps them crush main point questions also makes flaw, necessary assumption, strengthen, and weaken questions easier too. Why? Because all of those question types require you to understand how the argument is built. And the first step in understanding any argument is figuring out what it's trying to prove. So, if you master this one skill, spotting the most supported claim, you don't just get faster and more accurate on one question type, you raise your whole logical reasoning game. And here's a little secret most people don't realize. The LSAT isn't really testing 15 different question types. It's testing one thing over and over. Can you understand how this argument works? Once you can do that, the rest falls into place. A lot of students struggle with main point questions not because they're doing something wrong, but because they've been taught things that sound reasonable, but are totally wrong on the LSAT. The first big myth is that the conclusion is always the last sentence. Nope, the LSAT loves to mess with sentence order. Sometimes the conclusion's in the middle, sometimes it's at the beginning, and sometimes it's sneakily spread across two separate sentences. Relying on position is like guessing someone's job based on their shoes. It might work once, but you're going to get burned eventually. Instead, ask what's being supported. The second big myth is that the conclusion must sound assertive, bold, or dramatic. Nope. Sometimes the real conclusion is plain, low energy, nothing flashy. Meanwhile, a premise might come in hot. Strong verbs, confident tone, bold claim, and it's not the conclusion at all. So don't fall for style, focus on function. Ask, which sentence is the final destination? Which one are the others building toward? The third big myth is that the right answer always matches the wording of the conclusion. This is a big trap. The LSAT often paraphrases. It takes the exact idea from the conclusion and rewrites it using different words, different order, maybe even a totally different structure. So if you're only scanning the choices, looking for identical phrasing, you're going to miss it. Instead, match meaning, not wording. We tell our students this all the time. If the stimulus says, dogs are better than cats, and the choice says, cats are inferior to dogs, that's still a valid match, even though the specific words are different. What matters is that it captures the idea being supported. Now, students will sometimes say to me, they feel like they need to get the gist of what the passage is saying. I hear this all the time, and I get it. Your entire academic life trained you to read for the main idea, to be able to summarize a reading, to capture the spirit of the paragraph. You probably got gold stars for things like summarize the passage in one sentence or find the topic sentence. So when you hit an LSAT main point question, your brain kicks into familiar mode. You start scanning for tone, word choice, emphasis. You're trying to absorb the energy of the passage and convert it into a neat summary. Problem is, the LSAT doesn't care. This is not an AP English exam. This is a logic test. It's not about gist, it's about structure. The LSAT does not reward your ability to feel out a passage. It rewards your ability to track the flow of support from one sentence to the next. So yeah, getting the gist might get you close, but close doesn't cut it on a high-stakes test where one question could be the difference between a scholarship and 6 figures of debt. That's why we don't let our students just go with their gut when answering main point questions. We train them to ask, what claim is being built up? What depends on everything else being true? And what is the argument trying to convince me of? Because once you stop trying to summarize and start tracing logic, something amazing happens. The correct answers start to stand out like they're highlighted. You read a stimulus, and before you even look at the choices, you'll say to yourself, the author's trying to prove that X. Then you scan the answers and bam, there it is. Maybe not in the same words, but it's there. That's how top scorers work. Not because they're smarter, not because they read faster, but because they've trained themselves to read differently. And once you do too, main point questions stop feeling fuzzy and start feeling automatic. Now let's talk about the payoff, because yeah, it's great to understand arguments better, nice to feel more confident, but let's be real. You're also trying to go faster without getting more questions wrong. And this strategy, spotting the supported claim, is how you do both. Here's what happens to most students on main point questions, and honestly, most logical reasoning questions in general. They narrow it down to 2 answers. Let's say A and C. Then they go back and forth and back and forth. They'll say A sounds good, but C kind of restates that sentence too. But wait, A uses a different verb. Is that a trap? But what if C is too specific? Now, 3 minutes have gone by. You're sweating. You don't even remember what the passage said anymore, and eventually, you choose an answer just to escape the question. Sound familiar? This is what happens when you haven't locked in the structure first. But when you start by spotting the supported claim in the passage, before you even look at the choices, you're in control. You already know what you're looking for. So now, when you read the choices, it's not a vibe check. It's not a guessing game. It's a match the meaning game. You're now asking, which of these choices restates the thing I already know is the main point? And you're done. No ping-ponging between tempting traps. No wasting time comparing synonyms. It's fast, it's accurate, and it feels calm. When we coach students on this, that's the word they use the most. I actually felt calm during logical reasoning for once. And that matters, because on test day, you don't just want to be good at the LSAT, you want to feel in control of the LSAT. And this strategy, finding the most supported claim, is how you take control. It's how you cut through noise, ignore the bait, and confidently move on to the next question without second guessing. And that's how you stack speed and accuracy together, question after question, until you look up and realize, oh wow, I'm actually ahead on time, and I know I'm getting them right. That's the secret sauce. Now let's zoom out, because by now, you've probably realized this isn't just about main point questions. This is about understanding how arguments are built, and that's the real LSAT superpower. Once you learn how to ID the supported claim, you start to see a pattern across every type of logical reasoning question. Seriously, flaw questions, you've got to know what the argument's trying to prove to ID where it goes wrong. For necessary assumption, you can't spot the missing link unless you know what the author's conclusion is. And for strengthen and weaken, they literally ask you to evaluate how strong the support is for the main point. So when you learn to consistently spot the supported claim, it's not just one more tool in your LSAT toolbox, it's the very foundation. It's like learning to read music before you play an instrument. Once you can read the score, every note makes sense. And this isn't hypothetical. We see this transformation in real time every day. When we work with students, especially those stuck in the mid-160s, they often think they just need to do more practice. But doing 100 more questions without a new lens is like running 10 more miles in the wrong direction. The real breakthrough comes when they stop guessing and start seeing the structure, clear, logical, mechanical support flowing toward one sentence. Suddenly, everything clicks. They stop spinning their wheels, they get unstuck, and they start gaining momentum across the entire section. So, if you only remember one thing from this breakdown, let it be this. Don't look for the most important sentence. Look for the one being supported. That's the main point. That is the center of gravity. And once you can see that, the LSAT starts to look a lot less scary and a lot more beatable.